Thank you so much for joining us, Gemma. Be great to have a little chat to you today as part of Southwest Mutual's In Conversation With video series that we're doing about once a month now. Before we get into our three main questions, if you could give our viewers, our listeners, a little bit of an introduction to who you are and what you do, that would be really great.
Yeah, great. I work in economic systems change as a broad topic. So I did my PhD specifically in financial systems change, which was in collaboration with the Finance Innovation Lab. So I looked for quite a few years about really based on the question, we can more readily imagine the destruction of Earth and all of its ecosystems than we can imagine anything other than the current sort of capitalist system. So that's what I was really kind of motivated to look at. And so what I started to look at instead was about where are those experiments and where are those ideas that are part of the seeds of what we actually need to create next, and actively look for those spaces and those places where people are doing this differently. Rather than just focusing on all the bad in the current system, let's focus on what we can actually create. What can we do to make it better? So now I do a various amount of things. So I work with the regional banking movement. I write reports and sort of policy proposals for sort of banking and economic systems change. I'm a trustee of Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland, senior fellow of the Finance Lab, fellow of the RSA, things like that. So it's a bit of a portfolio career, but it's all got that overwhelming drive to how can we make people's lives better by making an economy that works for people and planet is kind of the main bit that connects all of those things together.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. So one of the first question that we have actually came out of an interesting Twitter conversation we were having with yourself and on the Southwest Mutual account. And it was a question from one of our followers about the use of GDP and ethical finance. So the question we have, bringing it back to a regional standpoint, is can GDP be a useful regional statistic? Because obviously in terms of how some councils work and how people understand the economy, GDP is often the go-to statistic.
It is, and it's an interesting one because everybody's heard of it, but until I started looking into it, certainly I didn't really know what it meant. I just knew it was a measure of how well we were doing. So you kind of understand GDP in terms of whether we're doing good at it or bad at it, and other than that, most people would never bother, and don't normally need to look into it. But what happens is in moments like this, so when we're in an economic crisis, which is because our GDP is falling, but the reason our GDP is falling is because we've chosen to protect people's health over the health of the economy. In the long run, you have to have a healthy economy, but that's why our GDP is falling right now. So in terms of, there are a number of points that we could go into on this, but in terms of regional economies, so regional data is never as good as the national data. And what I've found when I've been working on the regional banking and trying to find the data for that, it's quite hard to get that regional picture, because it's often in statistical terms, there's kind of, it's not that clear and we don't always collect that data regionally. But in a general point, is GDP a good measure for regional growth? Well, not really, because it doesn't actually tell us a lot about how we're actually doing. So you can have quite a good economy, but that if that wealth that's being created isn't being shared equally amongst people, then it's not doing any good. So what we actually need to think about is because it's things like GDP measures things like drugs and prostitution, and it doesn't measure all the unpaid kind of work that goes on in the home. So it's not there are lots and lots of problems with it that are recognized by many economists, but they don't know what else to go for and what else to measure. But really it's kind of thinking about when we talk about GDP growth in regions, what is it that we want to know about our communities? Like, what is it we want to know about our region? And why would we go to GDP when we could actually look at that? So one of the benefits for me of a regional banking system is that you would have local expertise, like you'd have business managers and bank staff who intimately know, without any national measures or any proxies, they know how well they're doing. They know if they're getting lots of requests from businesses for loans because they grow, because those businesses are doing well and need to expand. And they will have that conception, they will be able to respond to that accordingly. So I think that it's a clunky measure, and it doesn't always sort of tell us what we need to know about the economy in that sort of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. So it's almost, we need to start looking for other ways to measure what we actually mean when we look to GDP as a statistic.
Yeah, and Catherine Trebek from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance has this beautiful analogy. So she's like, GDP doesn't tell us where we want to get to. So she's like, what if as a measure of progress, because this is what people say is GDP is about the progress of your economies, but what it actually means is you're making more stuff. So, it's setting a concept that, well, if you're growing and you're making more stuff, then that's automatically good. But what if, the beautiful analogy Catherine uses is, what if we measured how many girls rode bikes to school? And that sounds so alien and so different to the system that we have right now. But if you think about it, well, if a girls are riding bikes to school, they're going to school and they're getting educated. It's safe to do so. So there's probably less traffic, less pollution. They're probably healthier because they're getting exercise. They're probably empowered and they're not frightened of being, assaulted or abused on the way to school. And if more girls are riding bikes to school, then more boys will be riding bikes to school. And it means that we have a different kind of system. You can see how that's a proxy measure, but one which measures the kind of things I think everybody would like to see for their children and would like to see for the future of, wherever they live. And it's just such a beautiful way to get us out of the GDP trap of just thinking in these narrow economic terms. Like, we have to start thinking about economies as things that serve us and help us to thrive, rather than just growing because it's a number on a sheet that's going up or down. Like, that doesn't actually help us live good lives in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that actually brings us really nicely onto our second question, which is, what is a wellbeing economy, and how far do you think the UK is from reaching that, from achieving a wellbeing economy? Like, we see this phrase kind of shared on social media, and occasionally it makes it into the mainstream. But yeah, I'd just love to hear your view on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it is the question for our times. And I think that the fact that lots of people are talking about this now is fantastic. And I think that, to explain it in a nutshell, a well-being economy is one that's purposed and designed explicitly to create human and ecological well-being. So to make an economy that works for people and planet, and to do that explicitly. So in our current system, we go for GDP growth, and we hope that that will eventually trickle down into better things for the people in the country. And there's no conception of like environmental limits and climate change and things like that. And a well-being economy is saying, right, let's recognize that there are kind of environmental limits to what we can do, but there's also like a social floor that we need to put into place, that everybody should not go beneath that. So everybody should have the means that they need to live good and happy lives. And it's really about sort of just being more realistic about the economy. So and actually can be agnostic about growth. Like, a wellbeing economy doesn't mean that everything has to stop and it's this like grim and kind of closing down of things, but that actually a well-being economy is one where we definitely want some things to grow. Like we need much more renewable energy, we need the growth of industries where we can have all of our homes retrofitted so that we're not paying loads of money to, you know, burn dirty energy to heat our homes or power our homes. And, you know, so things like that, there's loads of opportunities for wealth and growth and things like that. Other things that we probably actively want to degrow and actively want to stop growing. So it's really about designing your economy to fit with what we actually need within with an awareness of the environmental limits. And yeah, it's just, there's so much rich ideas. So, you know, there's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that works as an umbrella to just bring together all the richness and diversity across the whole world who are talking about these things. So you've got the stuff in New Zealand with the Wellbeing Economy initiatives that they've got going there is really exciting. But in terms of the UK, so just remember that second part of your question. So it's very varied. So I think everybody's feeling at the UK isn't a cohesive whole. There's lots of difference between the different countries and sort of regions that make up the UK. And partially that's because of the way that the politics is sort of set up. But there are some great things. So Scotland is one of the sort of pioneers globally in terms of thinking through wellbeing economies. So in the UK, we do have some exemplars of how we can do that. So in Scotland, they've got the National Performance Framework. So anyone who's particularly geeky and wants to think about how you could assess the measure of progress of your country that's broader and more like wider than just GDP, can go and take a look at that. It's really something very different to look at well-being economies. And their finance minister, their cabinet secretary for economy, said the other day that the time for a well-being economy is now. So there's lots of great language about well-being economies at the moment. I haven't seen that in the UK government as such. And recently this week, the Scottish government tasked a task force to look at economic recovery, and the name of their report is Towards a Robust, Resilient Wellbeing Economy for Scotland. So in the UK, there is some specialism with that, and I would love to see that replicated in other sort of regions. Wales has set up a Wellbeing Economy Alliance hub there to try and move that debate on in Wales. So on that national picture, there is some great things from some of the kind of governments that make up the UK, but there's definitely more to be done, I think, in England and the Westminster government to take that debate on and forward. So hopefully we'll see that as part of the economic recovery planning. But where we're doing quite well is in the UK. I said at the very beginning that, like, I'm interested in the places and the spaces where people are trying to do the economy better, where they're trying to be better and do better, because that helps us see and imagine how our lives could be enriched by doing things differently. And so there's loads of stuff on a local level and on a regional level that are part of a wellbeing economy. Okay, so wellbeing economy it's not going to happen just from somebody at the top saying, oh, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. You need some of those conditions set from the top to allow the localism to thrive. So things like the community wealth-being agenda, which is like the Preston model. If people Google that, there's some great articles you can read about it. And the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, they're doing some great stuff about how do we use the powers and the things that we already have locally in order to create better, more thriving economies that work for local people, like for the people in that area. So there's loads of great stuff in there. Obviously the regional banking movement, I think, is part of that story. So, you know, giving another option where you have local mutual banks and keeping that wealth in that area, that is about growth, because you're talking about keeping the wealth in the area. That means that keeping the money that people are saving going to the local businesses who are growing. That's a good kind of growth because it's inclusive. It's not an extractive growth where at the moment we put our savings somewhere and they get sucked off to largely like the south probably not far in the southwest where you are, but certainly in the southeast, the money tends to get stuck down there, and then there's a bit of that's what creates some of that inequality. So if we want a wellbeing economy which is about tackling inequality, then things like the regional banking movement, community wealth building are huge in terms of like getting us closer to that. So they're all definitely part of that rich tapestry of ideas and of projects that are going to make a better economy for us all.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's amazing. It's really encouraging to hear so many kind of projects and task forces going on, and what we'll make sure to do is to look up some of the reports and some of the articles that you've mentioned, so people can read more in the video description below. Cool, thank you. And our final question is bringing it back to regional banking. So you've been involved in helping other areas around the UK begin their journeys towards a regional banking system. How do you see those different regions working together in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they already are working together. I think that this is one of the things that shows you the difference between, a bank is a bank, but it's not, because, what we're seeing with the regional banking movement is, I'm constantly, well, not constantly, it's not every day, but like I'm always connecting up when I hear people are working or thinking about a regional bank. It's like, oh, you should speak to, Tony at Southwest Mutual, you should speak to Jules at Avon Mutual, like Jamie Driscoll in the North of Tyne Mayor, he's looking at the regional banks, which I've been supporting with, and connecting him up with the Northwest, who I've been supporting as well. And it's just about, there's a participatory methodology called Art of Hosting, and it says, what if all of the problems that we have are the result of conversations that we didn't have? So the idea is that if we can just get people talking together when they have some level of shared interest, and have that idea of there's a community of these regional banks, and I feel like that's already there, so there's nothing to do it to connect them up anymore, except that at some point that's going to need to be formalized because of the banking regulation, and the to make sure that there's no kind of banking cartels that emerge and things like that. That'll need to be formalized in some way as these banks develop and get further on in their journey to becoming a bank. So the Southwest and Avon Mutual are the furthest on in that process, and the Northwest and the Northeast are very early on in that process. The Welsh bank, Bank Cambria, that's doing really well, and that might also be quite quick. But as they get together, having what we know about stakeholder banking in other countries is that, yes, you have lots of mutual and cooperative banks, but they tend to work together as a network. Like, they see their strength in numbers, and it's about supporting one another and kind of making sure you can get those economies of scale you can get from working together, which makes them just much more viable sort of proposition. So I think it's always been the plan that there will be a level of collaboration, but each bank stands on its own 2 feet. It doesn't depend on each other, but they will be, richer and better the more that they can kind of collaborate and support one another. But certainly from everything that I've seen, I've been in touch with all of the emerging sort of regional banks in the UK, except for the London one, because that was a bit before I kind of got involved. And yeah, all of the people who are running them are super collaborative as people. They're super, they are the people who are motivated not to create a bank to make money, but to create a bank to improve where they live. Like, that's where these banks are coming from. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that collaboration and that networking is definitely, it is there, but it's emerging, and it will become the formal structure it needs to be for the regulator. But I think it will be able to pull in the people from outside of that banking movement to make sure the bank is doing what it needs to be doing for those communities and those regions where it's going to make all the difference.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. It's really good to hear your kind of external perspective on that, because we kind of feel it in the mutual bank that we know we're having these conversations, but it's really great to have your perspective on that as well. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been really fascinating to hear your perspective on all sorts of things that we've discussed today. If people want to find out more about you or get in touch, what's the best way that they can do that?
Yeah, I've got a website. It's allin.agency, which is
Okay.
my company I set up last year to try and do more of this kind of work. So I'll give you the link. I'm sure you
Yeah,
can put.
yeah, I'll put it in the bio. Great, thank you so much, Gemma.
Great, thank you.